Thanks so much for coming along. Hello. This is my first ever GDC, so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you. But I am going to try and keep all that excitement bottled up for just a little bit to talk you through games leadership. And today's talk is titled, We Need to Talk About Games Leadership, which sounds quite stern, because it is. We really do need to talk about it. And never, when launching a company called Games Leadership back in 2022, could I have predicted how much we were going to be talking about this, and how much more needs to be said and done in regards to long-term sustainability for the games industry. And let's face it, it has been one hell of a year. And when we talk about leadership, there are so many different places that I could go. Just the word leadership itself might conjure up some very strong feelings or images for you. And a lot of the beliefs that we have around leadership can be connected to the different experiences, good and bad, that we've had, not just from our interactions within the games industry, but all the way back throughout our own lifetimes. We are constantly changing and growing and shaping who we are as people. And alongside that comes learnings and mistakes that change how we approach and see things. So our ideas around leadership can also change. And what I thought I was doing right previously might now not feel so good. When I was a kid, there was a big trend in something called magic step shoes. And maybe you remember these. Not all of you might remember these, but I definitely did. These were shoes for kids that came with a key that unlocked the sole of the shoe to reveal a secret hidden gem. And as you can imagine, as kids, we went wild for these. But it very much created this in-group, out-group situation at my school where you were only cool if you had a pair. So, of course, from a mixture of peer pressure and some very clever daytime TV advertising, I started to pester my mum because I, too, wanted to be cool. Because cool meant power, and power in the playground was key. I wanted not just to fit in, but to have that level of, I have something you don't have. That status was going to validate both my self-worth, but also allow me to feel a sense of belonging amongst my peers, because these were important shoes for important people, and I wanted that. And my mom, seeing this, also wanted me to feel confident and powerful, so of course she relented, and finally I got my own pair of Magic Step shoes. And two learnings hit me at that moment in my life. The first was that I was not, surprisingly, instantly cooler to my peers. It didn't fix anything of what was going on there. That was a whole other problem. But my second learning was a lot deeper, and it started to create this change in my younger self and how I viewed the world. Because the shoes came with a hidden booklet that I hadn't anticipated. And the booklet said something along the lines of, you have been entrusted with a great secret, and these are magic shoes, but you must protect the secret. And so, because I was a very rule-bound child, I did just that. I took the responsibility of the shoes so seriously that when I went to school wearing them, I never told another child. Nobody ever knew. And of course, I very quickly lost the key that opened the magic gem because children and keys are not a great mix. And so then I was just walking around with shoes on, knowing that there was a secret inside of them. But now they were just shoes. And this moment had a profound effect on me because I learned that getting what I wanted hadn't solved the problem. And instead, it had opened up a whole load more choices and, in my opinion, ethical decisions that I hadn't been aware of before. And instead of power and belonging, I'd felt responsibility. The shoes came with this hidden agreement that to wear them meant to hide and protect the secret. And this went against the image in my head that I had of flaunting them around the playground. And yet I'd also watched some kids that had done just that and used it to create these in-group, out-group spaces, which has wielded them even more power. And that suddenly felt really uncomfortable to me. So I felt like power had been misused. And some of us had been misusing power, and some of us now were just wearing shoes. And obviously I didn't reason it exactly like this. I was only 7 or 8 at the time. But even then, I was able to formulate that something was happening in this situation. Something felt off about getting power in this way. I'd had an understanding, a learning in that moment about how the world works. And the biggest learning was that there were choices that you had to make in order to interact with it. And there's a lot to be said about these moments in our lives that have impact on us in this way. And I'll touch back on this later. I promise that my talk isn't all about shoes and my childhood. But perhaps you've got similar examples of relatively small moments in your life that have unlocked a deeper meaning and understanding for yourselves. But before we begin, let's just have a quick look at today's plan. I'm going to give you an intro into who I am and what I do. And then we're going to talk about power and why it's so important for us to begin to talk more about it, which will then lead into why it's so important for us to talk about power in context of the games industry. And then I'm going to give some insight into how we move forward with some of the challenges that are going to come out of this. And I'll bring in some of the findings that we're seeing within the work that I'm doing within games leadership. And finally, I'll try and wrap all of that together in regards to what it means for you, whether you're in a leadership role or not. And do please stick around to the end. I'm going to be giving you some access to free resources so that if you are interested in learning more about games leadership, then you can do so. And here are a few takeaways that I promised GDC that I would deliver over the next 30 or 40 minutes. Lots of things to get you thinking more about leadership in the games industry. So what is power and how does it show itself in games? What power and choices do you have? What's the challenge for leadership in regards to senior talent? How do we grow leaders and retain them? And then how are we going to move forwards with healthier practices? And not all of these takeaways for today are created equal. There are some promises here that I'm trying to cram into this talk. But if I was to ask you to focus and prioritize on just one of those, then it would be, what is your power and what choices are available to you in 2024? So forget what the world is doing right now, because it's pretty grim, and forget whether you have something stopping you or you feel like you're being stopped or restricted from doing something, and whether you're in a leadership role or not, whether you're in employment or not. Don't worry about those details. At the very least, I just want you to focus on who you are and what impact you can have, perhaps on this industry, perhaps on something else. It doesn't matter. And by the end of the talk, I'd love for you to take away something from that, starting to form ideas, even if it's just baby steps, as to what you might be doing differently following this. What might you get more curious about in regards to your own power and where you are right now? So before we jump into that, good time to tell you who I am and why I might be talking to you about these things. So my name is Melissa Phillips, and I'm the director of both the Games Leadership Network, which is a non-profit organization, and the Games Leadership Academy, which is a leadership training, coaching, and course provider dedicated to the games industry. And I'm a psychologist and a certified coach who has been working in games now for over 10 years, mainly in operations, but I'm still making games today. So even though my business is about leadership training, I'm still very much in the trenches and working with studios to help set up processes, creating strategies for more future-focused sustainability, and of course, helping support with people management and development. And back in 2022, I founded the Games Leadership Network, CIC, which is a non-profit organization that looks to offer free coaching and support for game developers in regards to leadership. And we currently have 2 main programs running. The change makers. So this is for those already in a leadership position who have the potential to be able to make changes instantly within their organization. And then we also have the emerging leaders for those who are interested in or hoping to move into or very new to a leadership role. And this also tends to cover more marginalized groups, those that have not yet had the opportunity to take in a leadership role. And as a company, we spent 2023 engaging with leaders from all over the world. We're a UK company, but we're not limited to where we offer this support. And I'm super proud of what we achieved. So in the last year, we supported over 90 developers from over 75 different studios all over the world. And whilst there are obvious cultural differences and every studio is unique, we unsurprisingly found that a lot of games industry leaders and the challenges that they're facing are coming from the same space. So there are definite themes and patterns emerging in this area. And so we're exploring all of that, both within our academy courses, but also continuing to work with the Games Leadership Network to really start to deeper dive into what best practice actually looks like. And I'll come back to this again with some signposting for anyone that wants to get more involved and ways to help out at the end. I'm going to keep moving us forward. So let's talk about power. And I thought a lot about how I wanted to position this talk today, because it's super easy for me or anyone else to take a side when it comes to power. I could come in and be very angry. Everything that we're experiencing right now in terms of survive till 2025 can easily be written as being the fault of rotten leadership. But that also ignores those that I do see fighting and doing good work in this space. And as a coach, as a psychologist, I'm curious about leadership, and I believe that people are interesting. So I choose to work with people on a very individual level. And what I notice when I'm asked to speak about leadership is that often people just want to hear the bad stuff, which is normal, right? Like we gravitate towards more shocking stories. It's more exciting. But once that's died down, we tend to move on to the next one. So we have this endless cycle of getting angry about bad leadership, and as a result, not talking about games leadership any further than that. We're not trying to understand what's happening, why, how, and more importantly, whether we can change it. We're just getting mad. And sometimes the big feelings that I have about power force me to take a side. We can't always have the luxury to sit on the fence. But that in itself, I think, is confusing. So sometimes I'm really angry about the injustices that exist because of power. I'll hear stories from my friends about their experiences in the misuse of power, and I am ready to take up arms. But at the same time, I can feel sad about why a person might actually be acting that way. I can feel frustrated with a person who makes the wrong choice and ultimately misuses their own power. And I'm also not perfect. We often like to think of ourselves as operating outside of this right or wrong measure. But have I made mistakes or decisions that have affected people around me? Sure. So what I'm trying to get at is that we often view this idea of power or leadership in terms of bad or good. And we bring our own set of values and judgments when deciding what we think are best practices. And we're very quick to blame or criticize when we view bad leadership, and often less practiced at applying those criticisms to ourselves or the people that we like. And so all of this can complicate a discussion around leadership, because that means when we talk about bad leadership in the games industry, we can be referring to everything from this person did an illegal thing and belongs in jail to this person made me feel a little bit weird. And both of those feelings are valid in discussion around leadership, but we often don't acknowledge the sliding scale and the complexities involved. Two people can also commit the same bad leadership decision, and one can remain in the industry without any recourse, and the other is cancelled. So it's complicated. And as I hinted at earlier, we can also tend to overlook good leadership. I'm in operations, so one of the measures for success in my role is often that everything just works how it's meant to. And you might not notice how good it's been until something goes horribly wrong. So shout out to operations, production, QA, code, and any of those who are desperately sticking things together in the background. So we know power is complicated, but what does this mean for the games industry? How are these structures affecting how we make games? And I'm going to get a bit controversial and challenge the idea that we've spent a lot of time investing in just trying to sustain the games industry and its leadership at its current level, keeping the status quo. We know we have a leadership problem, and we struggle to upskill people into leadership roles. We struggle to retain senior talent in our studios, and often in the industry in general. We know a large number of our workforce tend to leave games altogether the longer they've stayed. And I'm going to challenge that this has created a want to sustain and just keep things running as they are. And because of that, we've created structures that are in fact damaging to us and have locked us in place. So this repetition of churning through studios, and more importantly, people, hasn't really been benefiting us, or at least not most of us. And we've used excuses that we are a young industry to explain why we yet to find solid studio models and practices. And sustaining the industry as it is has led us into what is happening now. We haven't questioned enough. We haven't learned from the mistakes that have been made. And we haven't shared the practices that did work out and what we did get right so that others have the opportunity to learn from that. We've allowed power to remain small, and we've passed it around as though it was a currency, allowing success only for those in the chosen in-group or wearing the magic shoes. So my challenge is that instead of focusing on sustainability, what we should be looking at more are areas of regeneration. And traditionally, sustainability is about reducing harm. Regeneration is about finding innovative practices that can help restore systems in healthier ways, finding new ways of leading and working, trying out new structures, and ultimately not being afraid to address the mistakes we are making. And I don't think we can get sustainability in the industry until we've allowed for regeneration. Some of the beliefs that we are carrying have to die off first. So, how do we focus more on regeneration for our leadership practices? And I want to draw attention to some of the results within our program at the Games Leadership Network that focus on the changes that our participants have made. So we asked participants right at the start of the program what they think they need the most help with within leadership. And unsurprisingly, most report, I just need leadership skills. Just give me leadership skills and I'm good. I'll be a better leader. And then we asked them again at the end of the course where they feel the biggest changes have taken place and what's important to them going forwards. And what is interesting from this is that we can see that what they report changes ever so slightly. So we still see the importance of leadership skills in our top 5 categories. However, we start to see this emergence of self-confidence, being able to deal with anxiety better, and also the need to make changes within their own lives that are improving them at their work experience. And they're reporting that all of these things together are actually making them a better leader overall. And I think that's really interesting. That's the start, really, of our areas of research around this, and we're still looking at it as a nonprofit. And what I have to ask when faced with these results is, what changed during this process? What are these participants experiencing that caused them to then start to prioritize other things and make changes in their approach to their leadership? And we can't be sure because we need to test this further. But as a psychologist, I reckon it's highly likely that we've allowed for more awareness and curiosity and self-reflection to come through. And all of these things that we know are important in creating the right environment for change to happen. And as a result, we're seeing individual leaders start to make choices and challenge and change their previous leadership behaviors. And a phrase that I hear a lot and often thrown around within the leadership space is imposter syndrome. And I want to explore this a little with you, just as an example as to how our beliefs can change and affect our leadership practices. So firstly, this isn't a term that I like to use very often, but it's one that people are most familiar with and instantly understand when you say these words. So imposter syndrome is the idea that we're not enough, that we must hold ourselves back from exploring new opportunities in case people laugh at us. And I use this as an example as it's often the thing that people really want to change when they come to see me for leadership coaching. It's really getting in the way of their progress, and they put a lot of emphasis on how much this is holding them back. And I think I see imposter syndrome slightly different to most people, because my understanding when people use this phrase, what I hear is that they're generally referring to finding themselves in a high-value situation, but with a low sense of self-worth. So there's a mismatch of energy of, I understand how important it is for me to do this and perform well, but I'm constantly doubting if I can. And we've all been there, right? We all know this feeling. And if I bring this into the context of the games industry, it makes so much sense as to why a lot of us are feeling this way. High-value situation, low sense of self-worth. There are so many things in the game-making process that we, as a collective group, could just link to the potential to cause imposter syndrome. I think about the lack of senior talent pathways, sometimes the lack of any senior talent on a project at all. I think of the spaces where I see people leading with fear. This often comes with high-value situations, and then that opens up more specific examples. And these are all nuanced, and not every leader will obviously fit into these categories. But again, if we think of high-value situations, low sense of self-worth, where do we tend to see examples of this? And I've given you 3. So we've got new leaders, makes total sense, trying something new for the first time, not knowing if it's going to work or if it's the right thing to do. That makes us massively anxious. And then we've got what I like to call reluctant leaders, who didn't ever want to be in a leadership position, but have agreed to try because nobody else wanted to, or that they were the most senior on the project and by proxy someone had to do it. And these people can often be scared to annoy the team that they've grown with and that they love. They don't want to be seen as too authoritative or might be rejective of any leadership responsibilities because they're not even used to that. And then we have ego leaders who perhaps have something to prove, maybe highly unconscious, low empathy, but also low self-awareness. And this often comes with high levels of paranoia or maybe secret anxiety, terrified that they might be exposed for not having all the answers. And again, of course, I'm generalizing. There are a huge number of different examples that I could give you here where the term imposter syndrome might present itself in games. I'm just starting to connect the dots. So it's not surprising that we have people who are, for the first time, finding themselves needing to take on more leadership responsibilities. But as an industry, we don't have a great history of recording and sharing that knowledge for them. So we find ourselves in these high-value situations with low sense of self-worth, doubting ourselves as to whether we can do this, because likely we've not seen anyone else do this before, or we haven't seen it modeled brilliantly in our peers. And we're only really just starting to get like our first retirees in the industry. How many retirees do you know from games? Very few. And again, making games and building teams was super different for them when they started. It's changed so much. So passing this baton of games leadership knowledge becomes even more complex. And this isn't to shame anybody, by the way. If you do recognize yourself in any of those examples, then know that it is perfectly normal. And again, I just ask you to think of those feelings and bring you back to like being aware of your own power and the choices that are available to you right now. So why aren't we talking about games leadership? Well, we absolutely are. It's just that often we're focused on how to sustain rather than regenerate. We've become used to accepting things like imposter syndrome as being part of our daily lives. These are expected and sometimes shameful, so we don't talk about them publicly. And leadership is often in a hidden space where often they think they need to show strength. We rarely hear from our peers about how they're feeling or messing up. And we only tend to show our wins and not our losses. And as a result, we're not changing our power systems. We're going to keep the status quo. We're not rewarding learning or exploring in this space, and it's become about survival more recently, those that can tough it out the longest. And that comes back to a space of fear, creating scarcity, unsustainability, and in my opinion, more unimaginative studios and ways of working. So how do we start to change this? What does regeneration look like in the games industry? It's about creating balance. We've seen a huge amount of toxicity in games, especially in the last year, and everyone in this room will have a story, and I will guarantee you, about how not to make games, of that person who did it wrong. And if we lined all of these stories up to compare, we'd likely see that sliding scale again of generally weird behavior to absolute criminal toxicity. And we're going to spend a lot of time being mad about this, and rightly so. But my work in games leadership is teaching me that we have to start to become more curious about these moments. And that's not going to be easy. We're going to have to start to explore and understand which structures we've been allowing for these bad behaviors to appear and fester and cause harm. We'll need to be able to identify them and be loud about proposing alternative solutions. And some of us might be uncomfortable with that. And that said, there are things that can be done instantly. Embracing change in our organizations that we all know is needed and well overdue. And you'll know what I'm talking about here. It's the practices that make you feel uncomfortable right now, but you've done nothing or feel like there's nothing that can be done about it, or that might feel like a lot of work to solve. And the irony is that a lot of these things that we put off and procrastinate on can actually be fixed relatively easily. So I'm thinking of things like exploring flexible working, equal pay opportunities, providing clear roles and responsibilities for your employees, budgeting for your next game to include more holiday time, support, maybe maternity, paternity leave. And these are things that I see creative leaders sometimes ignore, purely because they don't think they know enough about it. And it's one of those things that if we admit we aren't experts in that area, then we might realize that we're not doing enough. But it's surprising how some of these things are so easy to fix. And then there's some changes that are going to be more nuanced, and it's going to come down to the individual needs of people making games. So this really requires more input and a deeper, more empathetic understanding. So for example, I can tell you we need to fix crunch culture in your studio, and you know that that's bad. And we can all get your team together and agree not to do it anymore. And yet, 6 months later, your team is still crunching. And when this happens, we're like, oh yeah, that's bad. But we don't know how to solve it. And often, sometimes, for leadership purposes, it's not always a bad thing. People pouring their whole life into making the product for us, there are worse things that we should be dealing with. So this is what I'm talking about. This is where I'm saying we're starting to have to take responsibility and thinking about people, the power dynamics that we've created, and why and how they should change. And it's complicated. It's more than just writing a policy. This is where regeneration has to happen, so that we can create more sustainable processes. It's not just creating change, it's creating and maintaining long-lasting change that becomes routine, that becomes practice. Bear with me a moment, I'm just going to take a sip. So finding this balance for our studio feels intimidating, and a lot. Which is why leaders will have to start to implement something, but they often give up when they don't see that it's lasting. So I want to share this attitude that I take when I'm trying to allow for something new to come in. And I do a talk that's just titled, "People are weird," and then in brackets, "and that's okay." And this is the idea that sometimes just being part of an existing team, whether that's games or any other industry, you have to get comfy with working with others. And other people are freaking weird. And I include myself in that, by the way. I'm weird, you're weird, we are all super weird, and at some point are going to do some weird stuff. And that's just part of being human. We're going to have bad days. We have triggers. We carry baggage, probably more than some of us need to. And we're also not always in control about how we're going to react to things or what those things are that we're going to react to. And mostly, that's okay. That's just part of humans living and working together. And part of leadership is accepting that I'm going to set a team a task, and sometimes they're going to go about those tasks in a way that was different to what I was expecting. And it's at that moment that I'm faced with a choice. And you'll notice that I'm all about choices, because often we forget that we have a choice in those moments. And the choice is how I'm going to respond to that. And how I will respond will depend on many different factors. It might be that my experience tells me, hey, we're doing it this way? Okay, but I know that that's not going to work because I've tried it a million times before, and I promise you this way is better. I might respond being more curious. Oh, we're doing it this way. Why this way? What might happen if we do it this way? Or if maybe I'm not feeling so confident in my leadership skills, I might get nervous. I might start looking to someone else to lead, and I might not challenge that we're doing it in a different way that's expected. And I might get defensive or start getting angry that we're not doing it in the way that I said. And how I respond is usually about me. How secure I'm feeling, both in my job, but also in myself. And you can see from just those simple examples how quickly that issue of the team doing something I wasn't expecting can either be rectified or become super sour. Good leadership is also hard to maintain. If we go back to that idea of balance and that people are weird and flawed and that's okay, that also applies to our leaders. They're not going to get it right every time. But depending on who they are, will dictate as to both how their studio and they respond to those things. And results from our first year of the Games Leadership Network suggested that people found it hard to express what leadership skills actually looked like. And when we talk about wanting to improve our leadership skills, that often what we need is help with our self-worth, our confidence, our own anxieties. So what does all of this mean for you? It cannot be a coincidence that in every industry I work in, whether that be psychology, coaching, HR, or game operations, then they all have this idea of the master or the expert in the field. And for each of those, the expert or master practitioner isn't considered to be the person who is just best at a certain thing, but instead a person who can wield knowledge from many different areas of their craft in order to kind of create a best chance approach for those around them to succeed. So number one, stop putting so much pressure on yourself. We need to start to be open to the fact that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about taking pieces of information about ourselves, our team, the game we are making, and applying that knowledge to create something that is flawed, but at worst, good enough to build upon. It's easy to view power as something that is constantly accumulating within our careers, but I also just want to draw attention to Darker Keltner's The Power Paradox. Now, the power paradox states that power is not constantly growing. It can actually be lost more easily than it is gained. And the power paradox also states that as one grows in power, we also naturally seem to lose empathy. So unless we're consciously aware and taking steps to hold power responsibly, then almost everyone who is consistently rising in power is likely to fall and have it removed from them. And we sometimes call this karma. But it's important to note that it is a genuine phenomenon that people are studying. So there's this balance to be had and sought if we want to have good use of power and also maintain our positions within leadership. Lots of people think it's just about getting there. Once I own my own studio, it'll be fine because I'll make the rules. Nope, that just starts another fun cycle of learning and noticing and trying to figure out what the new possibilities are that are unfolding around you. So I think back to my Magic Step princess shoes, and I wanted them to feel powerful and fit in. But once I learned the magic was a secret, how I wanted to wield those shoes changed. And nobody taught me that. My 8-year-old self made a choice with the new knowledge that had become available to her. And that's kind of how we learn. And I think that's how we grow as leaders as well. We start to accept that leadership is more about discovering what we didn't know before and then making choices around that new information that has arrived. So we've come full circle. And I just want to bring us back to this question, which is, what is your power and what choices are available to you now in 2024? And when I'm coaching, I often challenge people to think of the laziest response to these questions. We often set ourselves massive, sometimes impossible goals. So I want you to do the opposite here. I want you to think of the smallest, laziest step that you can take right now in terms of actioning some of the choices available to you this year. What do you want? What do you need? And then, what will you do? And before I leave you, I just want to signpost how you can get more involved with some of the different spaces that I'm working with in games leadership. And also where you can pick up our free resources. So first up, you can purchase courses, coaching, and leadership training directly from Games Leadership Academy. And I run regular discovery sessions around the different topics available, so please do sign up to the newsletter, and we'll keep you updated on those. There will also be an executive leadership course and a more general framework for games leadership coming later this year. So we cover groups, but also individual learning, so everyone is welcome. And then we also have a heavily subsidized and free options via the nonprofit organization, which is the Games Leadership Network. And this is designed really to help support those who need us when they really need us. We're currently looking for sponsorship and partnerships, as we're really keen to make sure that that remains accessible to the industry as possible. And you can donate to us directly, but also please do get in touch if you're an organization that might be able to do more with us. And then these two companies have come together to offer a completely free CPD course around an introduction to games leadership. This is an open resource available to everyone to come and just learn more about leadership in general, and start to get ideas about how we can better recognize power structures and create healthier change. So you can sign up and take the first part of that course now, which is titled A History of Leadership, and it comes with a free certification and workbook. We've just launched the course actually this week for GDC, so please do use the QR code and check out the website to sign up for that. I would very much welcome your thoughts and feedback on how else we might be better to support this community. Very keen. So this is brand new. Please send us your feedback. So that brings us to the very end. So please do keep in touch. Myself and my colleague Dan will be around after this venue for if people want to stay and chat and find out a bit more about what we do. But I'm also happy to answer any questions if they have anyone now. And thank you for coming along, and I hope to see you soon. So if you have a question, please let me know. I'll be out the front, or we can do it on have we got a floating mic?
Hi.
Yeah, we've got a floating mic going around. Any questions? I can't see.
I did have a question.
Hi. Over here.
Hi.
Is there a mic?
I'll just talk at you. It's all right. You're probably blinded by the lights. I was curious if you had tracked any metrics to, so you're saying the leaders you're training have these positive reports. Are you tracking any metrics with like improved employee morale, improved employee productivity, improved employee retention?
Right, not yet is the answer. So we ran our first cohort last year. We would love to work with an individual studio that would like to test those things and allow us kind of access to measure, because those things are difficult to measure, right? If I'm a leader, am I very good at spotting whether or not I am a good leader or not? That relies on the rest of the team to actually feedback. And as we know from sort of 360 reporting, that needs to have a good sense of psychological safety in order to do that. So it is difficult, but I'd be very up for the challenge of working with a specific studio to find out more about it.
Okay, thanks.
Hello.
Okay, I have about 50 questions right now, but I'll just narrow it down to one for right now. So I'm assuming a lot of us in here have leadership at our studios. How would we go about maybe exposing the bad leadership that is happening at our companies, and how would we approach that with the leads that we work with directly every single day? And then maybe leads in other departments, how would we approach that? Will we send them your link and hope that they don't get offended, or how do we go about that?
I mean, yes, I'm more than happy to talk to anybody that has any questions about that, about their specific workplace environment. My answer is always, for those not in leadership positions, to proceed with caution. And, again, that comes down to psychological safety. I'm a big advocate for, sometimes we have to know when we can or can't change something. And if we have the power to change something, we absolutely should go about that. But it's also not a failing if you realize that you want to change something and you can't. Sometimes we have to walk away from those spaces as well. So I advocate for making change in a safe way. I think the safest ways to make change within a studio is to have leadership on board with that and take a top-down approach. I've very rarely seen something come into a studio that creates change that doesn't have the backing of its leadership. And often when change is wanted within a studio, it starts from the ground up. So kind of games leadership is about how do we get everybody in that space and try and talk about awareness. In terms of bringing bad leadership up, again, it's so personal and so unique depending on the studio that you're in. So in terms of good practice, I would have that conversation if you feel like you are able to sit in a room and have that conversation with leadership of like, hey, I've noticed these things. How do we feel about that? There are ways in which we can have better conversations. If I talk about things like, we do workshops, for example, on managing managers or managing upwards. And it very much depends on the awareness and consciousness of those in those leadership roles. It's difficult, is the answer. But I'm more than happy to talk to you outside of this about it.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
Hi. So I guess my question is a little bit similar to his, but maybe you'll have a more specific answer. Who knows? How would you go if you're a sample employee dealing with feeling that your manager is the type that you described that was lacking self-confidence, basically? You see they're making decisions based on fear of the unknown rather than, and is there a way as an employee not to call them out, but to work in a way that would be more productive with them and try and push them in the right direction, maybe? Absolutely.
So I use the analogy of a cooking pot for the studios that we work in. There's a big cooking pot in the middle, and we're all bringing ingredients to this cooking pot. I'm bringing cheese, and maybe you're bringing chocolate. I'm also bringing coal and dirt. And we're putting it all in this pot, and we're going, it's going to taste delicious. And then we're tasting it, and it's like, I don't know why it doesn't taste delicious. But none of us is saying it doesn't taste delicious. We're just kind of eating this shitty soup, going, it's great. And actually, some of the biggest ways to create change is actually to have a conversation about that. Like, hey, guys, I'm bringing dirt. I was going to put it around the pot, but I put it in the pot. So it's how do we get that conversation? And what I'm actually talking about here is not ingredients. I'm talking about values. And every time that I see a situation in which there is friction within a studio, often it's about more minor things. It's less about doing wrong or being bad at leading, and more about noticing what that person is valuing. So, for example, I am rule-bound. I value keeping time. I value turning up when you said you would do something and actioning the action list and creating process. If I'm going to be paired with a creative that enjoys creativity and chaos and thinks that creativity should come from just having lots of unpracticed, unscheduled time, we are going to butt heads on a number of different things. And that's okay, right? That's totally fine. So when I'm having those difficult conversations, often I'm trying to put myself into the position of the other person and be like, hey, I see that you value, say, this creative chaos time. Cool. But I don't value that. I'm prioritizing structure and meeting this deadline. So how are we going to work together in order to create something. Because my way might not also be right, you know, like my way might interfere with that person and stop them from being creative. So it's about understanding that human element of like, it's not necessarily bad leadership, maybe they're just prioritizing something else. And so that's kind of how I would start to mediate. The real toxic stuff, and sometimes it's not worth your time. I'm going to bring it back to that. If it's dangerous, step away. But if it's a conversation about priorities, that's a really healthy conversation to have.
Thank you.
Sorry, can we take a question from the other mic too?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello.
Hi. Some of my question has already been answered with your responses to earlier questions, but to the point of like, sometimes you can't fix something, so you should walk away, or like, don't engage with trying to change management if doing so would be dangerous. I think that we've all had instances where we can tell where it would be dangerous, but I think we've all had instances where we were like, I'm not sure if it's safe to talk to this person about this. Any guidance on like building a barometer for that, looking at a situation and being like, I got about a 30% chance of this going really badly for me, and then I can make a weighted decision on whether or not I want to go in on that or avoid it.
Absolutely. So this is where women and marginalized groups come in, because we make these judgments on a daily basis as to whether it's safe to speak and talk about this. I would advise you to look at change management process. So change management kind of starts with the belief that basically you can't change anything but yourself. And so often we become obsessed with how do we change somebody else. And change management teaches us we can't. We can't change another human being. It's not my responsibility to change another human being. Even as a coach, as a psychologist, someone comes to me and goes, I want to change. Brilliant, I can work with that. But there's a space within, say, mainly in therapy, for example, where someone turns up and says, what do we call them? Like non-conformers sort of thing. They come up and they'll turn up to therapy and they go, well, I'm only here because my wife told me that she would leave me if I didn't come. But I'm here to do the therapy. That person isn't ready to change. So everything that we've taught as therapists in that moment goes out the window. Because we can't change that person if they don't want to. So everything, instead of trying to change that person, we switch our tactics to try and raise awareness, to try and bring more examples into that person's life, to get them to understand what is happening more around them. But ultimately, it comes back to you can't teach empathy in that way. They have to learn it themselves. So firstly, you can rid yourself of any, like, I need to change this person. It's not your responsibility. You don't have to.
Just as an example, like if you're doing that thing where you're like, I'm not going to change this person, but I'm going to bring new data to them. Sometimes that can also still get you in trouble, where you're like, so I noticed in this meeting on da-da-da day that da-da-da happened, and that made so-and-so feel such and such. And you can tell from the way that their face changes that you're like kind of on their list now. Mm-hmm. How do you avoid that from happening?
Again, you can't, is the unsatisfactory answer. But it is about, like you say, creating a barometer of how do I create safer spaces and safer structures. If that safe structure is not present within that studio, you can either try and create it, but that comes with the risk, like you say, of creating a problem for yourself, or you can accept that that studio isn't ready for that change and you can move on. And this isn't, I'm being brutal with this, but it's just in terms of like protecting ourselves as well at the same time. None of us, well, I don't think most of us aren't sort of trained psychologists, and it's not your job to psychoanalyze and be the therapist for those in power. What I would like to see is that we start to recognize what is healthy and what doesn't feel healthy. And most of the time we know that, right? That little bit inside your stomach that goes, I'm not happy here, I don't like it. And you'll know whether you can provide a change for that or not. If you can't, maybe you've got to pick your hills.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we put so much pressure on ourselves to succeed in this industry, and how that can create more ego leadership problems in the sense of people faking it till they make it and trying to present themselves as a leader when maybe they don't have that skill set yet, and how that can lead to conflict.
Yeah, so success is a funny thing, isn't it? And it's only recently, kind of in the last 10, 20 years, that like with the rise of social media again, we're only really putting out our wins, not our losses. So it becomes difficult, you know, this whole Instagram generation of instant fame as well. Again, I think back to sort of my early teens, where we started to see the talent shows come out, and it brought out this belief of overnight fame, that anybody, if they just wish hard enough, can just make it, and it's really easy. And the reality is obviously that, you know, making games is hard. We do it because we love it, but it's hard work. And we don't tend to talk about that bit. There is a book, I think Kim Nordstrom has done a book on success in the games industry and what that looks like. And they looked at, they went around and interviewed successful studios. And they found, I think, the overwhelming response for that was the studios that invested in like good coaching practices and actually improving on these empathy levels and investing in things like emotional intelligence and upskilling their talent and supporting them had better success than those that didn't. So we know that these sort of practices are starting to come through. It's just super early. In terms of kind of your own success as an individual, I go back to things like the power paradox. You know, we are, when I worked at BAFTA, we saw young talent come into the industry and looks like overnight success. And at that time, I worked a long time in learning and development, and we realized that there was a real need to support that talent as it became successful. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here with games leadership, is that we don't have those structures in place as an industry. We are seeing overnight success with huge amounts of money coming through with very little awareness in that space. I don't know. I think, again, I go back to regeneration and how do we change these structures? It needs the person at the helm to be self-aware enough in order to make those changes. If you are suffering from something like imposter syndrome, again, it needs the self-awareness in order to get help and support that. I always advocate for therapy, and everyone goes, oh, yeah, therapy. But it's great. Like, if you're in a leadership position, it is hard, and it's going to bring up things that you never thought about before you were put in that leadership position. So any of those little negative things that you haven't dealt with that you've been pushing off, like, it's time to deal with that so that you can help others. There's a lot of things like wounded healer. I don't know if that's a term you're familiar with. Often we see a wounded healer is the idea that those that want to help most are those that are most damaged. So often we have this kind of repetitive thing of like those that are most damaged trying to help and creating more damage at the same time. I think of some of the People Make Games documentaries. I don't know if you've seen these on YouTube. Fantastic documentaries about things that have gone wrong with toxic leadership in studios. And again, it spans from those that have done wrong to those that have kind of just made some weird choices. And a lot of those weird choices, I think, come from where people have unfinished business in themselves. So the biggest thing we can do if we want to sort of deal with our own feelings about success is get that help for ourselves first. Is that making sense? I'm rambling on.
It's great. Thank you. It was a good speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi. This might be a bit of a long-winded question. I'll try and go as concise as I can. So I'm just a student, studying game design, trying to move into the industry soon. And I've met a lot of other students here in the same exact boat. And this is an extremely trepidatious year to try and move into the industry. Super, like, weirdly negative stuff coming. I was talking to like some senior level, like CEO or something like that, and she said, in 5 years, you're not going to be here. And I was like, well, that's so annoying. Now I'm definitely going to be here. So I guess my question is, do you have any practical advice for people coming in to not get swept up in sort of these repetitions, these cultures that plague the industry. How to, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to this. There's those that are going to come in to an industry that is very scared right now. There's a lot of fear. Everybody is scared, even those in leadership positions. And then the other side of those that are going to start to make their own studios and do their own path as a result of I will show them and do. And both have potential for harm. Firstly, I'm sorry. It's a shitty time to come into the industry in terms of what's happening.
It's not your fault.
Thank you. But I think it's a good time to kind of talk about that and decide on what you want. In terms of those that are starting studios themselves and want to sort of just create their own space, one of the main challenges that they have is that publishers aren't allowing for things like budgeting for HR, support, lawyers, accountants, all of those things that actually will make you a better leader and give you more time to be creative and focus on your leadership abilities. So those are, when I talk about regeneration, those are the things that we can change as an industry that we should be changing for. And that's making sure that we are budgeting the right amount for the games that we're making. So my advice would be to make sure that you have those things. We're starting to see COOs appear now in startups, which we just didn't see so much beforehand. So I would align yourself with a business person, and so that you're going in with those practices wide open and that good practice. In terms of how do you survive as a newcomer to the industry, I think it goes back to your beliefs and values, and I think we've seen this concertina effect happen before. I know it feels bad, but we have seen it. I think 2015 was pretty awful, if we remember that far back, and about 10 years ago was pretty awful as well. But it does concertina. It comes in and it comes out. So it will come around again. So I would focus on you and maintaining you and figuring out what it is that you want and sticking to that.
Thank you.
I'm seeing waving hands at the back. Do we have to be kicked out?
We've got a couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes. Okay, I think we've only got one more question. Hello.
Hello. I've been thinking about this for a while, so hopefully I do a good job with this question. But I'm in a leadership position, and I wasn't the best leader when I started. I was kind of expected I thought I was going to be a shadow leader, not really a true leader, but that changed over time, and I think I've been doing a very good job becoming a leader. But I know there's still room to grow. So I was wondering, as a leader, how do you convince your employees to be able to speak up more and give them that freedom, but still be rigid and still be dedicated to getting your goal across? Because I still have to get my goals across, but I still want to be open and adaptable to as much as I can. So how do you find that balance? How do you communicate that balance? And how do you get people to feel safe to communicate to you?
Right. I mean, again, it depends on the studio, but I always have this conversation with leaders who really want me to give them the answer of something that they can do that will, I don't know, remove all bias from the situation. And I think part of leadership is just understanding that we can't. That, you know, when you are in a leadership position, the reports that you get back, can you ever be sure that what is being said to you directly, he who controls the power and the jobs and the bonuses, how do we trust that that is true? So my advice is always to either look outside of your organization and bring somebody in for that, or to try and create structures in which people are reporting to other people and not you within that organization, and trying to create a filter. Too often I see leaders that really want to be there in the trenches, part of the team, and sometimes that's difficult to do and creates an uncomfortable situation. So I'd always ask you to look at things like 360 reviews, for example, where everybody gives feedback, but you do a 360 review for you. And if you want to create kind of psychological safety within that space, sometimes that has to start anonymously. And I warn you now, the moment you open that floodgate, you have to also then be prepared for what they're going to bring to you. And that's the toughest part, right, is the moment that we start to say, well, I want to hear what you think, and then they tell you what they think. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to structure a response that feels adequate, both for them and for you? So you have to do some work before you start to open those doors as yourself, because you're going to have to think about, how am I going to respond? How am I going to action it? What if they ask me to action something that I don't like? Are we going to have that talk about values and motivations? Have I set clear goals? Does everybody in this studio understand what we're working towards and the motivations and what we're trying to make? And if not, why not? Because often that falls back onto the leadership. Have I been clear with this? And again, I would encourage you to go back to that lazy question. What's the least you could be doing in this space that you're not doing right now? Because again, we come back with this, I want radical change. I'm going to come in tomorrow. We saw it in COVID. I saw a lot of leaders kind of lose their minds about, how do I know that they're working? Well, it's pretty obvious, I promise you. You'll find out sooner or later. But we heard reports of, everybody into the Discord and turn their cameras on so I can see you working. And of course, that lasted maybe a day or two, because it turns out that watching people do their work is not very interesting or very helpful. So I would come back to you and ask you kind of like, what is it that you want to get out of it? What do you think? When I come in and work with a studio, I interview everybody, and I get all the results back separately, and I come to leadership. And my first question to leadership is always, what do you think they told me? And that's really interesting. What does leadership think they were going to say versus what did they actually say? Be prepared for all of that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I think that's it. Thank you very so much.